Why, thank you and welcome. We're going to really start on time today. And I thank you very much because at the bottom of our handout it says a distinguished guest deserves a significant Quest audience. So thank you so much, Questites, because we certainly have a distinguished lecturer today. Dr. Alon Ben-Meir is well known to us here at Quest. He is well known and respected worldwide as a noted expert on Middle Eastern politics and affairs. Dr. Ben-Meir, with a degree in philosophy and a doctorate from Oxford, is a senior fellow and a professor at the NYU Graduate Center for Global Affairs. His hosting of the center's program, Global Leaders, Conversations with Alon Ben-Meir, is unique in that his relationships with the highest-ranking political policymakers, particularly from the Middle Eastern nations, allow for us to listen in on an intimate conversation and debate in this area of expertise, international negotiations and conflict resolution. Dr. Ben-Meir has been directly involved with negotiations between Israel and her neighbors and between Israel and Turkey. An author and a journalist, Dr. Ben-Meir has a weekly article with the Huffington Post, the Jerusalem Post, Harvard Review, Middle East Times, as well as many other publications in both English and Arabic. He has been featured on ABC, CNN, NBC, any other arrangements of alphabet, Russia Today, Al Jazeera, both in English and in Arabic, as well as other Arabic networks. And an 8th book will soon be added to his published books. The subject of his latest book is concerned with the psychological impact of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So we welcome you. Thank you so much, Dr. Ben-Meir.
Thank you. Good afternoon to all of you. I hope you're having a wonderful day today. It's very nice weather outside. You know, as I was reading my experiences, writing, negotiations, I was finished. She was raising the ante more and more. And now I have a problem to deliver about all her promises. But I'm going to do my best. You know, we are now at an extraordinary critical juncture in the Middle East, and I should say even on this global scale. As we speak, the United States government, the Congress, the military are discussing what can or should be done in order to deal effectively with the rise of the ISIS, that is the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, and the menace that this group present to the Middle East itself, and certainly even to the United States and West Europe. And the President spoke recently about a plan of action. And in spite of his reluctance and concern not to engage, the United States is another military conflict in the Middle East. The challenge, the threat of ISIS is as such that no government, specifically not the United States, can ignore. Having said that, you know, many have reviewed, carefully dissected the President's strategy, some of which, of course, is very effective, necessary, and needed. Other aspect of it is not as clear. Perhaps it did not go far enough. What I'd like to do with you today is not review the strategy of the President, but suggest to you from my own perspective what, in my view, is going to take in order to deal effectively, degrade, and even potentially, albeit it's an extraordinary tall order, destroy ISIS. Let me begin with the premise that military alone, no matter how formidable it may be, and regardless who is going to be involved in this military campaign. That military prowess will not be sufficient to defeat ISIS. It is not because they are such a formidable power, but because of the nature of the battle, the nature of the fighting. Just by way of example, Israel is by far the most formidable military machine in the Middle East, but it had to deal only to a certain extent with Hamas and could not destroy, even wish to destroy Hamas. That is, the disparity between powers is not a formula to ensure a success. And here we have to carefully then look and ask ourselves the question, what is going to take to augment the military campaign in order to achieve the kind of objective we really want, and that is, at a minimum, complete the degradation of ISIS, if not, as I said, destroying it altogether. And here I must take you to three different aspects that I consider critically important. Number one, we need to understand the root causes. That is, you cannot fashion today a strategy to deal with anything, specifically in such kind of conflict, unless you understand the background. What precipitated that? How this came to the fore? What are the forces behind it, both real and psychological? And only when once we understand that, at least to some extent, then we begin to think in terms of what is going to take, and the answer to that is going to be more than military. What are the root causes are numerous, and I don't want to spend too much time on it other than suggest a number of things. Number one, we have to understand that the Arab world, at least since the creation of the various states in the region, with the exception of Iraq, were all created in the wake of World War II. And ever since, every single Arab country has been ruled by ruthless dictators, emirs or kings, who have subjugated their people, abused them, deprived them of every possible human rights. The young, in particular, have been living in a state of despondency and despair for decades. What they've been watching, however, is the West. The West has been, by and large, supporting these ruthless leaders and despots in the name of regional stability. We have tolerated Saddam Hussein, and we have tolerated al-Qaddafi, and Mubarak, and Assad for 40 years. Assad family came to power more than 40 years ago. And we have tolerated all of these despots because it served our interest throughout this period. But the young men and women in the Arab world are finding out that that they've been used, they've been abused, not only by their own leaders, but also by Western powers. Now, if we take you a little further, in the years, we come to other events that further aggravated to a great extent what happened, and that is the Iraq War, the Iraq and Afghanistan War. This is a war that was out of choice. We went there. We basically dismantled the state. We handed the Iraqi Sunnis, who were ruling the country since 1922 till 2003, to the hands of the Shiite, and as a result, basically giving Iraq on a golden platter to Iran itself. We have changed, in a very short period of time, the entire geopolitical conditions in that part of the world, and introduced a complete revolutionary change. And that is, even today, if you ask Sunnis in Iraq, if what happened to them through so-called democratic process is what should have happened, and will tell you, their power was taken away, and many of them even believe that they are still the majority. What happened subsequent to the American invasion, and once after we have left our troops from there, is the near civil war in Iraq. Tens of thousands have been killed, Sunni killing Shia and Shia killing Sunnis. But again, if you look at the Arab youth, will tell you that this is the mistake, the error of Western power. Of course, they blame their leaders, but what they see happen is that here the United States came from nowhere and changed the entire geopolitical dynamic of the situation in Iraq. This followed with another intervention on our part in the wake of the Arab Spring. The wake of the Arab Spring, I want you to imagine there are more than 170 million Arabs under the age of 25. The majority of them have been living, as I described to you, under intense subjugation, deprived of opportunities, of job, of decent education, of healthcare. And with the technological revolution, with the information revolution, they realized that this is not how they want to live. And they rose against the government, starting in Tunisia, and in Libya, and in Egypt, and then in Syria. But the one thing that we have done, that was, in my view, the worst thing that we could have done, is trying to introduce political concepts such as called democracy or democratic reform into communities and nations that have had no experience, no clue how this works. They know they wanted to be free. But the freedom alone is not enough when you wake up in the morning and have no food and no opportunity and still no jobs. I want you to understand that the second terrible mistake is that we completely ignored the fact that the only group that's been organized throughout this period, 6-7 decades, are the Islamic groups, be that in Nahda in Tunisia or the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt. And when they were given the opportunity to vote, it was abundantly clear to us that they will be the one who will win these elections. And we know now what happened. As a result of these elections, writing a new constitutions, Morsi came to power in Egypt, other Islamists came into Tunisia and in Libya, and then we have created a new chaotic situation. And finally, another counter-revolution in Egypt brought back the military to power, and nothing really has changed. But now the Egyptians are happier. Albeit they went back to the era of Mubarak. Which reminds me, with this fellow who has very small house, 2 bedrooms house with 7 kids. And he didn't know what to do. He went to the rabbi and said, "Rabbi, please help me out. We can't even breathe. We are 9 people in these 2 small rooms. What can I do?" He said, do you have 2 ghosts? And then he said, "Yes." Then bring him to the apartment, to the house. A week later, he rushed back to the rabbi and said, "But this is becoming even more ridiculous. I cannot live 7 people plus my wife and I with 2 ghosts." He said, "Do you have some chickens?" He said, "Yes." He said, "Put 7 chickens also in the house." And finally, he brought most of his animals back into the house. And this guy went absolutely insane. Finally, he went to the rabbi. "What shall I do?" He said, "Take the chickens and the goats and the lambs all out." He did. And then he went back to the rabbi and said, "Now I feel relieved. Now we feel I can live in this apartment." And what happened in Egypt is exactly what happened there. That is, they moved from dictatorship to dictatorship, but then they realized, well, perhaps Sisi is much better than Mubarak. But the truth of the matter, essentially, nothing has changed. what I'm suggesting to you is that democratic process is a long, long process. It took the West hundreds of years to get to the point where we are today. And we attempted to shove it down their throat. And as a result, we are experiencing now counter-revolutionary movement in Libya, and we saw it in Egypt, and we still see the slaughter, the horrible slaughter that's taken place in Syria. But then again, you know, what other phenomena? Here we are, presumably want to intervene in order to improve the life of the young. We've been witnessing the ongoing, horrifying civil war in Syria without hardly lifting a finger. And here again, with this current technology and information, the whole Arab world, especially the young, are saying, how could this country, the United States, be simply watching the slaughter of more than 200,000, more than 10 million refugees and internally displaced people, and half the country is laying in ruin. And this is not hindsight to suggest to you that more than 3 years ago, I said, like many others, we've got to do something before Syria disintegrates. We've got to do something with the Iraqi government, with the Maliki government, in order to create a little more cohesive situation in Iraq to stop this madness. The rise of ISIS, you have to understand, is not accidental. They have been in many different countries and been learning and nurturing and planning. And when they saw a vacuum in Syria, they have readily converged into that vacuum. And what we are now witnessing is a formidable group that has been able to expand its territorial possessions from Syria as well as a big part of Iraq. I mentioned this brief to you because it is very important to understand that without going back and review this historic background, it is hard to say today, okay, what is going to take to deal with the situation today? It means by employing merely military force, yes, you can dismantle, you can degrade, maybe even destroy ISIS, but then what is going to happen the day after? That is the big question. Because what we are going to be witnessing is another uprising, is another slaughter, is another civil war. And as it is, even if we deal effectively with ISIS, we're still going to have to deal with the ongoing Sunni Shiite war waged by proxy between Iran and Saudi Arabia. So we are in a pretty much a big mess. And it is not easy to say, well, we should not get involved. The United States has no choice but to get involved. We have a huge strategic interest in the Middle East. We are basically the only power that can project some kind of a global stability. No one else can. Look around. Not China, not Russia, not European community, nobody. So those of us who say, well, why should we? We don't have a choice. Because American interest is threatened, American strategic security is threatened, American allies are threatened. And so even this reluctant president, who was naive at times in his assessment of what is going to lead a country like the United States, finally came to realize that something needs to be done. Now at the stage, we need to do something about it. Now have to take one. Do we just go and fight and hope for the best? Or are we going to have to do something simultaneously along with our military campaign? And I must tell you, I personally am absolutely convinced that unless we are engaged simultaneously with significant, massive socio-economic and political development throughout the region, our military campaign will be, even its success will be temporary at best. Which means the young men and women in the Arab world, they are not going to wait to see who is going to win, who is going to lose. They want to change their lot. They want to change their conditions, their situation today. And so United States efforts, whereas has a focus now on the military aspect, it must also focus at the same time on how to develop specifically the social economic condition in all of these countries in order to give hope for the future of these young men and women. Because what happens today, the fact that they are idle, the fact that they are despairing, the fact that they are despondent, the fact that they have no place to turn to, they will choose extremism. They will choose anybody or any group or anything that is willing to embrace them. And if that is going to take revenge against the government that they hate with passion, and against the West that they resent so much, so be it. That's what they want. Which means we need to make sure that the countries involved, be that Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Iraq, all the countries that we're going to have to deal with, within the conflicting area and beyond that, must make a supreme effort to begin sustainable development project to provide jobs, to provide opportunity, to empower the people, to give them a chance so that as the war going on, they have something to hold on to. They are not going to wait for another 10 years because they can't wait. They will not wait. What I am suggesting to you is that other than asking Saudi Arabia or Jordan or Oman or Abu Dhabi and other countries in the Gulf and even in the North Africa to merely provide some kind of support, military aid of some kind to the campaign, to the military campaign, they must commit themselves to economic development program to begin a process in order to stem the flow of these young men and women to extremism. That is, there is no other way. It is expensive, it is time consuming, it's not easy, but there is no other way but to provide a means by which these young men and women can hold on to the future and say, we have something to fight for. Not only they will not join the extremists, but they will work against the extremists. Anywhere in the Middle East, anywhere in the Arab countries. So I cannot overemphasize the importance of this as a pillar, as a significant pillar that will aid the military campaign. The third element I want to touch upon is the various countries that are involved or will be involved in this campaign. And I have expressed some cynicism in terms of how these countries in fact going to cooperate and to what extent they will in fact be able to support this campaign. To begin with, I want to start with Iraq. The last few weeks, 5-6 weeks, we were watching to see if there's a new Iraqi government. And finally, Abadi was selected, and finally, Maliki was pushed out, and finally, there is so-called representative government. I must tell you that this is illusion. This government is no better than the previous government. And this is a question of convenience for them. And for the United States to count on, now we have a new government in Iraq that is going to take the fight onto to ISIS, is completely misguided and misleading. We're going to need more than just a picture of a representative government. We're going to need something far more serious. Iraq is in the midst of a civil war between the Sunni and the Shiite. The level of cooperation between the two sides will have to be so profound to be able to present a unified front. So only happen the Sunnis in Iraq, who see more eye to eye with ISIS than their government, the Shiite-led government, have an interest and will have interest in dealing and fighting ISIS if they get something in return. Which means, in my view, we need to mobilize the Sunni community in Iraq, the tribal areas. There are millions of them. And we have to make sure that they be, instead of joining ISIS as they have been, fight ISIS. And the only way to do so is we have to go back to basics. Can Iraq, after the Iraq war, be put together again? And my answer to that question is no. The Kurdish community already have their autonomous rule. And where the Sunni are going to need some form of autonomy just the same, provided they can also benefit from the revenue of oil that's coming from the central government. That is, in my view, the United States, the administration, ought to, when it appeals to the Sunnis in Iraq, it should make it also abundantly clear to the Shiite that we are going to work toward establishment of an autonomous rule for the Sunnis. And with some loose federal connection to the central government, as the case it is already today, is the central government, and the participation of the Kurds is really minimal. But that has to be now constitutionally done in order for the Sunnis to know that the day after the fight is over, we have something that we can hold on to. That is a must. And that is not, as yet, on the administration agenda, which in my view is a terrible mistake. Syria. United States now I decided to train the rebels. After 3 years of screaming something needs to be done to help the rebels, now we finally allocating $500 million to train 5,000 rebels in Saudi Arabia. 5,000 rebels in Saudi Arabia, under the best of circumstances, they can hardly scratch the power, the tenacity, the viciousness, the cruelty of ISIS. Which means we're going to have to think of a strategy whereby these rebels are not operating alone. But also because they cannot fight ISIS and Assad forces at the same time. As it is, they are weak. As it is, they are not ready. As it is, they have suffered tremendous losses over the last 3 years. Now we expect them to fight the ISIS, and then how do they will be able to withstand the continuing onslaught, the bombing of their communities by the Assad forces? Which means, in my view, what is necessary now to do in Syria, not merely to mobilize the rebels, which is needed, but also at the same time as we have to attack ISIS positions in Syria, we must also degrade at the same time Assad military forces, specifically his air force. By doing so, we can not only free the rebels from focusing on ISIS, but we weaken Assad enough in order for him to rethink his position. I must tell you that when you talk to Alawite today, that follow that, the sect that actually committed to Assad, they have now reached a point of exhaustion. And they are saying they can see their life going on without Assad. They are expressing this sentiment to a lot of people, including to the United States. And what needs to be done now is that to assure the Alawite that they will not be slaughtered should Assad is moved from power. And they can do so only by enlisting the Sunni, who are a majority in Syria. I repeat, the Sunnis are the majority in Syria. That once the political conditions change and they come to power because of sheer numbers, then they'll have to work on truth and reconciliation instead of killing each other and revenge and retribution. That is not a pipe dream. Because they know what will be the consequences otherwise. Neither of them can benefit from continuing this horrifying, tragic genocide taking place between the two sides. The second element, we cannot bomb ISIS in piecemeal, slowly, carefully here and there. We need to overwhelm them. They have to be overwhelmed both in Iraq and in Syria simultaneously with massive attacks in order to prevent them from being able to regroup reorganize, and recruit a new people. That is, an early degradation of their powers will prevent them from rising again, from building new fortification. And that is exactly what is needed in order for us to be able to weaken them to a point where it will be impossible for them to recover. So the onslaught, our attacks has to be massive, simultaneous, and that is the only way you're going to be able to deal with this kind of a group. That is as far as Syria goes. There are those who have illusions about what Turkey will do. I must tell you that no one should expect Turkey to lift a finger. As a matter of fact, Erdogan has been allowed the Turkish borders open for thousands of volunteers to go and join ISIS in Syria and Iraq. The Turkish government, as we speak, continue to buy oil from ISIS when they captured many of these oil fields in northern Iraq. Erdogan, who is deeply Islamist, is not interested. What we are basically is paying lip service, and the United States have said nothing. If any of you heard anything about what the United States about Turkey, what Turkey is saying about what's going on? Not a word. Turkey is not in the picture, and it should not be in the picture, because Erdogan is not interested. He, in fact, supports this group of extremist Islamists, as long as they are extremist Islamists. For the same reason he supports Hamas. Then you have to move to Iran, and the question with Iran was, should Iran be part of the coalition? I think it was wise on the part of John Kerry to say, no, it should not be part of the coalition. I think everybody who follows Iran's foreign policy, domestic policy, will tell you, Iran is dedicated to one thing and one thing only, what is best for Iran. And the notion that the enemy of my enemy is my friend is false. In this particular case, the enemy of my enemy is very much my enemy, remains my enemy. Iran will not be a friend. And the Saudis, as a matter of fact, understand that better than anyone else. Iran and Saudi Arabia are competing for regional hegemony. They are waging a proxy war, both in Iraq and in Syria, between the Sunni and the Shiite. Iran being witness, supported the Assad regime to slaughter his people for the last 3.5 years, providing him with every aid possible. Military, money, equipment, personnel, trainers, whatever you name it, they provided. Iran has to stay out of the conflict. But there's a more important reason for that. Iran needs to maintain its influence in Iraq and its foothold in Iraq and its influence in Syria. That is the basic tenet of its regional strategy. In precluding Iran, we will be able to take Syria out of Iran and break that linkage from Iran all the way to the Mediterranean. Because that is the crescent that Iran would like to continue to control. I maintain that now we have an opportunity to remove Syria from that, provided we actually have the courage and the tenacity, the capability, and the will, more than anything else, the will to go about it in a manner so that to overwhelm Assad, to overwhelm ISIS. And if you were to ask me, is it possible militarily, I can tell you with absolute confidence the answer is yes. Not based what I think, it's based what major military people in the United States and others have been saying and continue to say. As of this morning, the Chief of Staff, General Dempsey, even suggested that it may be necessary for us to place ground troops in order to finish the job. It's doable, it can be done. We have other countries marginal. My feeling is that leave Jordan out of the equation. Jordan King Abdullah is in a very tenuous situation. He has nearly 2 million Syrian refugees. He's not in a position that he can offer very little in terms of intelligence and otherwise, but certainly no ground troops. And moreover, should Jordan become under any kind of attack from ISIS, Israel will have to be involved in that. And this is something that should not happen, because Israel will not allow the status quo in Jordan to change in any manner, because that would represent major danger to Israel's national security. Qatar is pretty much like Turkey, supports extremist Islamic movements. It has a lot of money, but perhaps unlike Turkey is prepared to provide some kind of assistance. But I don't think Qatar is such a significant player that we ought to be too much concerned about. They will pay lip service, and that's just about it. The only significant other power, really, that in this mix is Egypt. Egypt is the most powerful Arab state in the region, without a doubt. And Egypt can, if it wishes to send ground troops if necessary. I personally doubt whether Egyptians will commit themselves to ground troops, to go all the way to Iraq or Syria. But I want to be also, we have to really be very, very clear that this war against ISIS cannot be won by air attacks alone. This has to be abundantly clear, which means we must assemble significant ground troops wherever we can get them, train them, and we have them be ready for that kind of fight. And the only country really that need to do it, will have to do it, first of all, is Iraq and Syria, who are under the immediate threat. But then the Saudis also should get involved, and some other smaller countries in the region, because they cannot simply buy their way out anymore. They've been doing now for dozens of years. Buying by money, they've been owning and buying just about everything they want. That's got to stop. Now they're going to have put their mouth where their money is, or their money where the mouth is. And this is what is necessary. That means the United States is going to have to put the kind of pressure on these countries that if you want this war to be won, you're going to have to do more than just provide lip service, more than just money, more than just ideas and advice, but you're going to have to put some real troops on the ground, because this war will not be won without a group. Because this ISIS, just like Hamas, is dispersed already throughout the civilian population. And if you just bomb from the air, you're going to kill tens of thousands of innocent civilians, maybe hundreds of thousands. And this is precisely what General Dempsey said this morning, that there may be a point in time where we need to do that, even the United States, because the nature of this particular enemy and what they may or may not be able to do. So the question today, this is in my view a campaign that ought to include the careful consideration of what was, what did bring this about, and incorporate that into a plan of action that has to begin, along with the military, is economic, socio-economic development. Not to push for democratic reforms, but to push for opportunities for jobs. And that is what is going to need to happen as soon as possible, because this is also a very, very long process. And it's not going to happen overnight. But when the Arab youth need to see is the beginning of a process, to begin to believe that change is in the offing, that is going to happen. They're not going to have to live another 5 or 10 or 15 years in pain and despondency. That there is a future for them. Because in the final analysis, when you look at all the jihadist group, all of them, with no exception, they grow and thrive because of the condition that these Arab youth find themselves. And now they open their door and give them an opportunity, and hence they flock into these extremist groups, and now we can see the results. What picture can we envision now for the future? That is, assuming that ISIS is degraded completely, and assuming it has become basically a nuisance, no longer a threatening entity. Does that mean Iraq will go back to the way it was before the war in Iraq? Or does that mean Syria is going to go back to the way it was? The certain things that happen in these countries, in Libya, in Syria, and Iraq, they no longer can simply put together again. It's been broken. Which means we need to prepare for the other element. And the other element, what do we do in the day after, even though we have already undertaken all these development, economic and others, to create jobs, to create opportunity, both from government projects as well as NGOs that they can work day in and day out for that objective, we're going to also have to think in terms of what sort of political input we're going to have. That is, shall we get stuck with the notion that Iraq was one single unit, it has to remain one single unit? Should we get stuck with the notion that Syria is going to have to come back in a single unit? Is there any other system by which we can help them develop political system so that they can maintain their national integrity, but not necessarily one with the other as it was before? That is not going to happen. And hence, which means that now we're going to have to think in terms of now, not after the defeat of ISIS, but now. That is, we have to assume with confidence that ISIS will eventually be defeated. Otherwise, the United States will not enter this kind of campaign. But I would like to also to see in the blueprint what is going to happen tomorrow, once this is done. And that has to be spelled out. That is, if we want the Arab youth, again, to be able to mobilize them, to support this effort, and to continue the process of reforms, we need to begin to think in those terms. More importantly, until now, 4 or 5 countries been affected by the so-called Arab Spring. All the Gulf states have not been really affected by it, and most of North Africa, other than African state, other than Tunisia. I want to make you know that, in my view, what we have witnessed today as far as the Arab Spring goes is only the very beginning. We have years, if not decades, to go to see ongoing turmoils. That is just how it's going to be. The only way we're going to reduce that or contain that is by making sure that those countries still in the Gulf and North African states understand it is only a question of time when their young men and women will rise against them. Which means if we want to avoid future explosions, future turmoils, which is going to affect our interests in one form or another, we have to begin guiding these kingdoms and emirs and all of that the time has come for them to change their approach. It is ironic that Saudi Arabia, who is now trying to wage this war against ISIS, Saudis forget that it was they who continued to export the culture of beheading and stoning people to death, to this day. It means what I'm saying to you, it means that if we have any influence over Saudi Arabia, and we do, and many other countries, we're going to have to tell them this is a time to stop and think. They want to stay in power, there's no question, and they can still stay in power, provided they change the approach how to govern. It is no longer top to bottom approach. It will not work because subjugation and servitude will not continue, it will be impossible to sustain. It's going to require opportunities for the people without necessarily for these kings and emirs to lose their power base. These are the things we have to think about today. in order to begin to chart some kind of a stable future for the region. Not to speak of other parts where there is other concern, a great deal of concern, like the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. You know, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is one that has kept reminding every single Arab young man and woman how biased the United States is. Whether any of you agree or disagree with Netanyahu's policy, the fact remains that because of this policy, American interest and credibility in the region is diminishing. So it is not enough just to deal with ISIS. We also must begin to focus anew about such conflict that must be resolved in one form or another. We have to take a much firmer stand with the Israeli government and say occupation is not sustainable, because this is another element in the mix of the Arab outrageousness that something has to change. How many more Gaza wars are we going to have to witness? Do we have to witness another intifada in the West Bank? These are elements that continue to add fuel to the fire of extremism. And we have to deal with that in order to stem that kind of agitation that is feeding into what we want to stop, what we must stop. What I am suggesting to you when we talk about then American foreign policy, with the best of intention, because of timidity, aloofness on the part of this administration, or reckless, adventurous approach of the Bush administration, we have now gone through 14 years of American policy that has been going nowhere. What we have done, we have created a situation in the Middle East that has been considerably worse than ever before. And what I'm suggesting to you today is that this approach has not worked, it is not working, and we have to step back and think what can be and what should be done. Unfortunately, or fortunately for that matter, there is an election in 2 years or so. But I always ask myself today, if there were to be an election, do we see some bright stars, shining armor that can rise and say, well, I'm going to lead? I don't know. I want to conclude by suggesting to you, many of these events in the region happen also because of lack of leadership. Leadership. If I were to ask you around today, think of one leader on the global scale, one that matched the stature, the strength of Roosevelt or Ben-Gurion or Truman, you would be at a loss. There is none. It is that curse of lack of courageous, visionary leadership that has brought us to the state of where we are today. I'm not sure how much and how far and when can we change that picture. But I only can hope that we learn something from the last 14 years, plus 2 more to go. And the poor President Obama, who came with the terrible inheritance of 2 wars, an economy on the verge of bankruptcy, is going to have to leave the office with another war behind him. Then comes the question, will the next president actually make sure that he or she doesn't leave the White House with another war? Thank you very much.